Let's see, let's go ahead on to conservation planning. I'll invite Lee Grinnell up to the podium to introduce everybody.
All right, lovely to see you all. Thanks for coming. I'm Lee Grinnell, team leader for conservation planning. Our team crosscuts in a lot of the work that we do. So some of the work that we've been involved in, you'll hear referenced in some other teams. Today, with our 20 minutes, we are going to focus for you guys on a couple of big efforts that have been going on since our last partners meeting. And these are unique, I think, the scale of them in some of the work that we historically have done. And they are participatory science in a way that we haven't really been engaged with in the past. So we're going to have two dear friends of CNHP, David Augustine from the Department of Agriculture, and Tom Cardamond from the Watershed Biodiversity Initiative are going to tell you about this work. These are projects that have some pretty sophisticated spatial analysis from our landscape ecologist, Michelle Fink, combined with some really, really robust stakeholder involvement in the design and implementation of the science, as well as the planning and priority setting that are flowing from the science, and all of that built on data collection from the field. So David Augustine is gonna tell you about some prairie work first. Our research scientist, our conservation scientist, Anna Davidson, who has been working on these projects with David, will pipe in. We'll hear from Anna's online, Tom Cardamond, with the Roaring Fork project that you were introduced originally to a couple of years ago is online. And then Renee Rondeau, who probably is a legend in her own time, you probably all know her, is also online. She's gonna wrap us up. And just off script for one hot second, I will say that my one and only experience of honest to goodness vertigo was on that shale slope. So thanks for that flashback, Raquel.
All right, thanks. So my name is David Augustine, and I'm an ecologist with the USDA's Agricultural Research Service. And I'm here today to tell you about a project that we've been working on for the past several years that we refer to affectionately as Homes on the Range. And this is a collaboration between ARS and CNHP and a whole long list of other collaborators where we're trying to identify potential landscapes for conservation across North America's central grasslands, focusing on integrating keystone species, particularly black-tailed prairie dogs, land use patterns, and climate change. And I won't go through the whole list here, but I will call out Michael Menifee is, I think, the only other collaborator here in person today, has been a big part of this. And also it's been funded by the WAFWA, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So this has been a collaboration with all 11 of the state wildlife agencies that have black-tailed prairie dogs. So the methods we've used in this project are to identify potential landscapes for grassland conservation. Start with generating a black-tailed prairie dog habitat suitability model, and that's mostly what I'll show you in the brief time I have here today. And then looking at how climate change will affect suitability of prairie dog habitat across the species' entire range. In this effort, you can see on this inset with the pink map there, that's the range of the black-tailed prairie dog across all 11 states in the Great Plains. And then finally, what we wanted to do, the first two efforts were mostly biological and physical in nature. In the third effort, we want to identify current and priority areas within predicted suitable habitat that are most amenable for large-scale landscape conservation of black-tailed prairie dogs. This is looking at things like land use patterns and social willingness for prairie dog conservation. So for the habitat suitability model, these have been done regionally for the species in the past, but this was the first effort to really bring together data across the entire range of the species and produce a model at a very fine scale resolution for that entire range. So we brought a very large database on prairie dog colony occurrences with things like temperature, precipitation, land cover, etc. And the main thing I want to show, this is the final ensemble model that was derived from 3 different approaches. So we did 3 different ways of modeling habitat suitability, one with generalized linear mix models, one with a random forest model, and one with a boosted regression tree model. And then we fused all 3 of those approaches together into a final ensemble model. Did a lot of work in terms of verifying this with independent data sets. And this modeling effort, I just want to call out Michelle Fink from CNHP. She was the one who did all the really heavy lifting in terms of the programming and the model fitting. Really a great effort there. Huge amount of computing power to look across the whole range. You can see, so the darker green areas are areas identified as biophysically most suitable for prairie dog conservation, lighter areas less. We also took this and looked at it in terms of future climate change. One, under a warm and wet scenario in the future, how will distribution change? We still keep some habitat in the southern plains there. And then under a hot and dry scenario in which it predicts substantial loss of suitability in the southern Great Plains. Then the next stage in this process has been working with the states to bring in landscape and social variables. So this is like level of fragmentation. You can have a small patch, a square mile of great habitat out surrounded by a lot of cropland, not a great place for conservation priority. So bringing in landscape factors like fragmentation and land use patterns, as well as county level variables for encompassing suitability or social willingness for conservation. And so this is where we arrived. This map on the left is where we ended up with a prediction of the pink and reds are the areas with highest suitability for landscape scale prairie dog conservation and conservation of associated species that require large landscapes. And on the right, you can see overlap in terms of the green areas show overlap in terms of where it's both highly suitable and conducive for conservation efforts in the current climate as well as in future climates. And that's all I'll say. The habitat suitability map is finalized now. And so we're working to make that available to partners. And if anybody has efforts, I can think there's a lot of synergy there in terms of bird conservation efforts. How does it overlap priorities for birds? How does it overlap priorities for rare plant species, et cetera? So we're working to make that available to anyone who would like it. This is still being reviewed by the states, the second step right now. And I think that's all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David. So Anna's going to pop in and share a little bit here. I think she's got about 3 minutes worth of content for you. Can you hear us, Anna?
Yes, I can. Hi, everyone.
Yay. Hello.
Hello. Yeah, shall I go ahead and begin?
Yeah, are we advancing your slides for you? I think that we are.
Yeah, I understand you will be.
It's not working again. It kind of doesn't like me or something. There we go. Okay. Here we go. All right. Awesome. Just tell us when you want to advance the slides, Anna.
We can start now. Okay, great. I can see them. Hello, everyone. I wish I was there in person. But it's so great to see starting to get together in a more normal way. I'm going to talk very briefly about our work in strong collaboration with the USDA ARS, David Augustine, Lauren Prensky in particular, and a whole suite of other colleagues, and work that's being funded by NIFA. This work focuses on understanding prairie dog colony dynamics and how prairie dogs can coexist harmoniously with cattle. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. That's perfect. Previous one. The previous one that focuses on, yep, that one. The first part of the work that I wanted to highlight is on our paper that's currently in press. It is on the boom-bust cycles of black-tailed prairie dogs in the Thunder Basin ecosystem. It is a paper where we identify the colony expansion and collapse over time, over a 21-year period. When you look at this figure, the gray polygons are indicating these expansion periods, recoveries, following collapses that we're calling the bust periods. These collapses or busts are following plague. So we have identified them in this Thunder Basin ecosystem. And the next slide is highlighting a paper that we have currently in revision that identifies the consequences of these boom and bust cycles on black-tailed prairie dog colony associates, birds and mammals. We end up finding large-scale declines in those birds and mammals that depend on the colony habitat that prairie dogs create, as well as depend on prairie dogs for prey. And next slide, I want to highlight the overall research program that we have going on in collaboration with USDA is to understand how prairie dogs and cattle can coexist in a way that supports both livestock production and grassland biodiversity. Next slide, please. The overall goal of this work is to understand how these boom bust cycles play out over time, what the drivers are, where and when we might be able to intervene to help create a more stable system that is less volatile and so therefore supports the species that associate and depend on prairie dogs, as well as occurs in such a way that supports the livestock production needs of the local communities. We're doing this work in two complementary ways. One is through a suite of long-term data that have been collected across the range of black-tailed prairie dogs, including the Thunder Basin ecosystem and the Pawnee National Grassland. This work, we're using ecological modeling to understand these complex ecological relationships. Gabe Burrell is our postdoc on the project who's leading a lot of this work. And then we're also incorporating a large community-based participatory approach on the ground, particularly at the Thunder Basin grassland ecosystem. Our goal is to incorporate the interests of the local community, the ranchers, what they need, and we work with them on the ground to help collect the data together and co-create the decision support tools that come out of the research that we are working on. So there's a large community-based effort to try to understand these patterns and these relationships between livestock and prairie dogs, particularly in the Thunder Basin ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. So next, we're going to go ahead and roll a cool little video that Tom Cardamond made. So if, back in the booth, you want to throw that up on the screen here.
Good morning. I'm Tom Cardamond, Director of Watershed Biodiversity Initiative. It was almost 2 years ago to the day that I presented to you the very beginnings of a study called the Roaring Fork Watershed Biodiversity and Connectivity Study. We engaged the Colorado Natural Heritage Program to do the science and engaged representative members of the whole community, the key stakeholders, to both frame and follow the study and guide the study along the way to make sure that it would lead to meaningful conservation action. There were three catalysts really that inspired us to take on this study. One, global concern for diminishing wildlife populations, and a particular concern about diminishing birds across North America, as well as dramatic decreases in insect biomass on a worldwide scale. More regionally, our elk, deer, and bighorn sheep populations were suffering significant losses in many cases, from 20 to 30 to 50 to 75%, depending on the species. That was creating some alarm, really, locally and regionally. And then finally, our open space and trails program in Pitkin County, which makes up a large part of our watershed, had adopted a biodiversity policy to protect and restore and enhance biodiversity. Wonderful concept in need of some science to inform on-the-ground biodiversity conservation. First step then was to gather together key stakeholders, the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the Open Space and Trails Program, and 4 conservation-oriented, educationally oriented nonprofits. We wound up focusing on elk, deer, and bighorn sheep as 3 species about which we knew a great deal, that in many ways could be proxies for all of biodiversity, because saving habitat for them would cast a net over much of the biodiversity in our watershed. That group sat down in early 2018 to frame the study. Concurrently, we were in conversation with Colorado Natural Heritage Program and engaged with them to do the study, and really took on the study in 3 parts. One, field work in the summer of 2019, largely focused on private lands, because that represented data gaps in our knowledge base. Second year, 2020, focusing on public lands. And then in 2021, extrapolating those field plots on the ground to satellite imagery and machine learning to characterize the entire watershed, and then going back on the ground to make sure how we were characterizing the landscape was accurate. Now we have test-driven the study with our science team. It's been well received. There's a great deal of enthusiasm for how applicable the information we put together and the multi-layered maps and the conservation opportunities map that is really a centerpiece of the output of the study. And now we're poised to take this information and engage our community in informed, collaborative conservation action to protect and restore biodiversity on our million-acre watershed. Let me leave you with a few big ideas that we hope this biodiversity study will inspire and inform with solid science. One would be reconnecting large landscapes that have been fragmented in our watershed, knitting together connected landscapes to restore and sustain deer and elk populations, guiding development to avoid fragmentation and maintain connectivity amongst swaths of largely intact landscape. Conversely, identifying and protecting large isolated landscapes for bighorn sheep, which because of disease transmission need to be isolated one herd from the other. And finally, identifying the importance of wetness in the landscape and its correlation to species richness. The study helps us identify the best places to protect and restore riparian and wetland ecosystems, shifting from what we like to call dry-parian to riparian, and effectively creating and restoring a second snowpack so that our snowmelt, which is our primary source of moisture, is captured just a bit down gradient, meted out slowly, adding to the wetness and richness of our landscape. I want to extend a huge thanks to CNHP for doing the hard work, the heavy lifting of the field science and the lab science to make this study come together and provide us with a really useful tool for collaborating within our community to do landscape scale and meaningful and enduring conservation. Thank you, CNHP.
Thank you so much, Tom. This is so wonderful. I'm so glad you taught us a word, riparian. I'm going to use that one now. We have time for a very short little wrap up here from Renee Rondeau. Are you with us, Renee?
I am. Hello, all. So great to see you virtually. I just have 2 slides, so if somebody could just advance them, that'd be great. That looks like the wrong one.
We don't have your slides. You want to show those on your screen there? for us?
Okay, sure, I'll try. That's interesting. Okay. Let me see what I can do. If I can't, well, yeah, look at that. I think I can do that. Sorry about that. And we will just go here. Okay, hopefully y'all can see that. Sorry about that. So I'm just going to wrap this session up saying, hey, what's next with conservation planning? And it's always good for us to sort of guess in some ways what's coming down the pipe. And through decades of doing conservation work in Colorado, one of the things I have noted is there's this pattern, and we just saw it with the last two talks. Biologists get out there, they collect data on some common widespread species, prairie dogs, sage grouse, deer, elk. And after they do that for many years, the alarm bell goes off because what they see is a decline in a common species. It goes from a G5 to a G3. That alarm bell then gets other folks interested in it. We develop working groups. We start to say, hey, how do we get a strategy? How do we put together a conservation strategy? How do we reverse that decline? And so that pattern has played out. And so the question now is, what's next? What's that next pattern? What are we going to see next? And here's my crystal ball, and that is with pinyon jays. I have not heard pinyon jays mentioned yet today. These birds are incredible. They they're very strongly associated with pinyon juniper woodlands. And they're colonial, they're very social birds. So folks that study them get addicted to them, as they say. This map on the bottom is from Breeding Bird Atlas, and it's anything that's red is a decline, anything that's blue is a positive. And basically what we're seeing is there's a 4% decline in the population of pinyon jays since the 1980s. And it doesn't matter how we slice and dice it. We can look at the range-wide distribution. We can look at Great Basin distribution. We can look at the Southern Rockies, New Mexico. These charts over here all show the same pattern, a very serious decline in this species. It's not federally listed, but other states are really thinking about this. And so I want to put this into your mind, put this into the back of your mind. Keep this present. And I want to give a big shout out to a couple folks here. And that would be Scott Summershoe with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of Lakewood. He has been the coordinator for a range-wide working group. And they have developed a pinyon jay conservation strategy. I highly recommend taking a look at that. And then a big shout out to Amy Seglin and Liza Rossi with CPW on the West Slope. They are totally taking this species to heart and collecting data on it. And they are now developing a working group, just getting off, really just getting off the bricks here is this working group from CPW. So that's that. I'm going to leave it at that. It's exciting to see what's coming down. And so keep this in the back of your mind. And I know there's a lot of other what next things, but this one is one I wanted to focus on. So thank you all. Great to see you. I'll stop sharing so that you can go back, Dave.
Awesome. Thank you, Renee. That was wonderful. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up the conservation planning section of the agenda, and I'm going to welcome Jeremy Seamers up to the podium here to get started with the zoology update.